I was standing in the scrapyard watching the hydraulic crusher reduce the pristine white BMW to a cube of twisted metal when the satisfaction finally hit me. The car that was supposed to be my graduation gift, the car that was meant to kill me, was now worth exactly what my stepmother had always said I was, nothing. But I was worth everything, and I had the paperwork in my purse to prove it. The thing about being reborn is that you remember everything. Every cruel word, every manipulation, every moment when you should have died, but didn't. In my previous life, I had climbed into that beautiful BMW on graduation day, excited for the first time in years, believing that maybe Patricia had finally accepted me as her daughter. I had driven exactly 3 miles before the brakes failed on the mountain road leading to the ceremony. The impact had been instant. The pain had been worse. But here I was again, 18 years old and armed with 24 years of memories that no one else possessed. This time, I knew exactly what Patricia had planned. This time, I was ready. My father had married Patricia Whitmore when I was 8 years old, 2 years after my mother's death from cancer. At first, I had been grateful for a mother figure. Patricia was beautiful, sophisticated, and seemed to genuinely care about making my father happy. What I hadn't understood then but knew with crystalline clarity now was that Patricia had never intended to include me in that happiness. The abuse had started small, accidentally forgetting to pack my lunch for school, throwing away my homework and claiming I must have been irresponsible, scheduling father-daughter activities for Patricia's own daughter, Melissa, during times when I had important events. My father, blinded by new love and desperate to keep his beautiful wife happy, had dismissed my complaints as jealousy and adjustment issues. By the time I was 16 in my previous life, this psychological warfare had escalated. Patricia had convinced my father that I was troubled, manipulative, and possibly dangerous. She had planted drugs in my room and discovered them during a staged intervention. She had intercepted college acceptance letters and financial aid documents, ensuring I had no path forward after high school. Most devastating of all, she had slowly poisoned my relationship with my father until he saw me as nothing more than a burden and disappointment. The inheritance had been the final straw. My mother had left me a substantial trust fund, accessible when I turned 18. Patricia had spent years positioning herself as my legal guardian for financial matters, forging documents and manipulating my grieving father into signing away his oversight. She had planned to claim the money the moment I turned 18 and then arrange for my convenient disappearance. The brake failure hadn't been random. In my previous life, I had died believing it was a tragic accident. But now, with adult eyes and bitter experience, I could see the truth. Patricia was a killer, and she had been planning my murder for a decade. The difference this time was that I remembered everything, including the detailed layout of our house, the location of Patricia's hiding places, and most importantly, the exact timing of her plan. I also remembered something else, my mother's sister, Aunt Catherine, who had tried to maintain contact with me before Patricia systematically destroyed that relationship. Aunt Catherine, who was now a federal prosecutor with resources and connections I had never known existed, but I was getting ahead of myself. First, I had to survive the next 3 months until graduation. Then, I had to turn the tables so completely that Patricia would never threaten anyone again. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening in March. Patricia had called me into the living room with that false sweet smile that used to fool me completely. My father was working late again, conveniently absent for whatever fresh hell she had planned. "Aria, darling," she said, her voice dripping with fake affection, "I have some wonderful news. Your father and I have decided to get you a graduation gift. A car." In my previous life, I had been stunned into grateful silence. This time, I knew exactly what that car represented. "That's incredibly generous," I said carefully, watching her face for the micro-expressions I had learned to read. The tiny tightening around her eyes when she smiled, the way her left hand clenched when she was lying. "What kind of car?" "A BMW," she said, practically purring with satisfaction. "A beautiful white 3 Series, perfect for a young woman starting college." Her emphasis on starting college was deliberate. She knew I had no college prospects in this timeline either. She had made sure of that. "When do I get it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Graduation day, of course. We'll drive it to the ceremony together. Won't that be special?" Special, yes, that was one word for premeditated murder. That night, I began implementing the plan I had spent months developing. The first step was the hardest. I had to make contact with Aunt Catherine without Patricia discovering the communication. In my previous life, I had been too young and isolated to reach out. This time, I was armed with knowledge and desperation. I created a new email account using the library computers and sent a carefully worded message to my aunt's work address. I didn't mention Patricia's murder plans, not yet. Instead, I focused on reestablishing contact and hinting at concerning behavior in my household. Catherine responded within hours, and we began a careful correspondence that would lay the groundwork for everything that followed. The second step was gathering evidence. Patricia thought she was clever, but she had no idea how thoroughly I had memorized her routines and hiding places. I knew about the falsified guardianship documents in her bedroom safe. I knew about the forged financial records in her office filing cabinet. Most importantly, I knew about the mechanic she was bribing to sabotage my car. Using skills I had learned in my previous life's adult years, I began documenting everything. I installed tiny cameras in strategic locations. I photographed documents when Patricia was out. I recorded conversations using a device Aunt Catherine had discreetly provided. Slowly, methodically, I built a case that would destroy Patricia's life as thoroughly as she had destroyed mine. The third step was the most dangerous. I had to let her think the plan was working while secretly preparing my counterstrike. Graduation day arrived with cloudless skies and perfect weather. Patricia was practically glowing with anticipation as she led me to the garage to reveal my gift. The BMW was exactly as I remembered. Pristine white paint, leather interior, and a set of brake lines that had been carefully compromised to fail after exactly 3 miles of driving. "Oh my God," I breathed, allowing genuine emotion to color my voice. The emotion wasn't gratitude, it was rage. "Patricia, this is incredible. I can't believe you did this for me." "Every graduating senior deserves something special," she said, her smile sharp as a blade. "Why don't you take it for a drive? Make sure everything feels right before the ceremony." This was the moment. In my previous life, I had eagerly agreed. This time, I had a different plan. "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I want to take some pictures first. This is such an amazing surprise. I want to document everything." I began taking photos of the car from every angle, making sure to capture the license plate, VIN number, and most importantly, the underneath where the brake lines had been tampered with. "We should probably head to the ceremony soon," Patricia said, a note of urgency creeping into her voice. "You can take more pictures later." "Just a few more," I insisted, continuing to document the evidence. "I want to send these to Aunt Catherine. She'll be so proud." Patricia's smile faltered for just a moment. She had spent years ensuring I had no contact with my mother's family, and the mention of Catherine clearly unsettled her. "I didn't know you were in touch with your aunt." "Oh yes," I said brightly. "We've been corresponding for months. She's been so supportive during the college application process. In fact, she's probably already at the ceremony. She flew in specifically to see me graduate." This was true. Catherine was indeed at the school, along with 2 FBI agents posing as family friends. But Patricia didn't know that yet. "Well," Patricia said, her voice strained, "we really should get going. You can call your aunt later." "Absolutely," I agreed, but I was thinking, this car is so beautiful, and I'm so nervous about driving it for the first time. Would you mind taking it to the ceremony? I can ride with Dad and meet you there. That way I can really appreciate it when we get back home." The suggestion clearly frustrated her. The whole point was for me to drive the car, to be behind the wheel when the brakes failed on the mountain road. But she couldn't push too hard without revealing her true motives. "Don't be silly," she said, forcing another smile. "It's your gift. You should drive it." "I know, but I'm just so overwhelmed. Please?" "I promise I'll drive it plenty after the ceremony. I just want to make sure I'm focused on graduating today." After several more minutes of back and forth, Patricia grudgingly agreed. She would drive the BMW to the ceremony while I rode with my father. The irony was delicious. She was about to drive a death trap of her own making, though she didn't know I had already had the brake lines professionally repaired the night before. But the real surprise was still waiting for her at the school. The graduation ceremony was held at our high school's outdoor amphitheater, a picturesque setting overlooking the same mountain road where I had died in my previous life. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I spotted Aunt Catherine in the audience, flanked by two serious-looking individuals in dark suits. Patricia, seated several rows behind my father, had no idea that her world was about to implode. The ceremony concluded without incident, and families began gathering for photos and celebrations. Patricia approached me with her usual fake smile, clearly eager to get me alone with the BMW. "Congratulations, sweetheart," she said, air kissing my cheek. "Are you ready to take your new car for a proper drive?" "Actually," I said, "I have something to show you first. Some people I'd like you to meet." I led her toward where Catherine was standing with the FBI agents. Patricia's smile began to waver as she recognized the official nature of our approaching companions. "Patricia Whitmore?" one of the agents said, stepping forward. "I'm Agent Martinez, FBI. We need to speak with you about some financial irregularities and safety concerns regarding a vehicle registered in your name." The color drained from Patricia's face. "I'm sorry, what is this about?" "This is about the attempted murder of your stepdaughter," Catherine said, her voice cold as winter. "Among other charges including fraud, forgery, and embezzlement." "That's ridiculous," Patricia sputtered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Agent Martinez held up a tablet displaying photos I had taken of the compromised brake lines. "These images were taken this morning of a BMW registered in your name. Our forensics team has confirmed that the brake lines were deliberately severed in a manner designed to cause catastrophic failure after a short distance of driving." "The plan," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began, "was for me to drive that car down the mountain road after graduation. The brakes would have failed on the hairpin turns. It would have looked like a tragic accident." Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Around us, other families were beginning to notice the commotion, and I could see my father pushing through the crowd toward us. "We also have evidence," Catherine continued, "of systematic financial fraud involving a trust fund established for Aria by her deceased mother. Bank records show unauthorized transfers totaling nearly $3 million from accounts you've been managing under forged guardianship documents." $3 million. Even in my previous life, I had never known the full extent of what Patricia had stolen from me. The number hit like a physical blow. "And then there's the matter of the bribery," Agent Martinez added. "Payments to Franklin Auto Repair for services that specifically included brake line tampering. Mr. Franklin has already agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for reduced charges." Patricia's legs gave out and she sat down hard on the nearby bench. The carefully constructed facade of respectability was crumbling in real time, and I felt a savage satisfaction watching it happen. "Aria?" My father's voice cut through the crowd. He had finally reached us, and his face showed confusion and dawning horror as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" "Dad," I said gently, "Patricia has been stealing from me for years, and this morning she tried to have me killed." The next few minutes were a blur of explanations, denials, and mounting evidence. Agent Martinez showed my father the financial records, the photos of the sabotaged car, and the documented communications between Patricia and her accomplice at the auto shop. Catherine explained how I had reached out to her months earlier, how we had worked together to build a case, and how the FBI had been investigating Patricia's activities. My father, a man I had loved and lost in my previous life, looked older than his years as the truth settled over him. "Patricia," he said quietly, "tell me they're wrong. Tell me you didn't do this." But Patricia had nothing left. The evidence was overwhelming, and her carefully maintained lies were collapsing under the weight of reality. When the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, I felt a sense of closure I had never experienced before. As they led her away, she turned back to look at me one last time. The mask had finally fallen, and I could see the pure hatred in her eyes, the same hatred that had driven her to plan my murder. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed. "That money was mine. Everything was mine." "No," I said calmly. "It was never yours, and now you'll never hurt anyone again." The aftermath unfolded exactly as I had hoped, but even better than I had dared to dream. Patricia was charged with attempted murder, multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The evidence was so overwhelming that her lawyer advised her to accept a plea deal, but Patricia, in her arrogance, insisted on going to trial. It was a spectacular mistake. The trial became a media sensation. The story of a wealthy socialite who had systematically abused her stepdaughter and attempted to murder her for an inheritance captured public attention in a way that ensured Patricia would never live down her crimes. Every sordid detail was aired in open court: the forged documents, the stolen money, the years of psychological abuse, and finally, the plot to kill me with a sabotaged car. Melissa, Patricia's biological daughter, testified against her own mother. The years of witnessing Patricia's treatment of me had left Melissa with her own psychological scars, and she was eager to finally tell the truth. Her testimony was devastating, describing in detail how Patricia had taught her to view me as an obstacle to be eliminated. The mechanic Patricia had bribed, faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of accessory to murder charges, provided detailed testimony about how Patricia had approached him, how she had paid him to sabotage the brake lines, and how she had specifically instructed him to ensure the failure would occur on the mountain road during my drive to graduation. Most damning of all were the recordings I had made in the weeks leading up to graduation. Patricia's own voice, captured on digital audio, discussing her plans and her hatred for me. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. At 62 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. But the criminal trial was only the beginning. The civil suit that followed allowed me to recover not just the $3 million Patricia had stolen, but additional damages for pain and suffering, the destruction of my relationship with my father, and the attempted murder itself. Patricia's assets were seized and liquidated to pay the judgment. Her house, her cars, her jewelry, her art collection, everything that had represented her stolen wealth, was sold to compensate me for what she had taken. More satisfying than the money, though, was watching her reputation crumble. The scandal destroyed her social standing completely. Friends who had once envied her lifestyle now crossed the street to avoid being associated with her name. The charity boards she had served on issued statements distancing themselves from her. The country club revoked her membership. Melissa, freed from her mother's toxic influence, chose to testify on my behalf during the civil proceedings. She revealed additional instances of Patricia's abuse and manipulation, painting a picture of a woman whose cruelty knew no bounds. The relationship between us, poisoned for years by Patricia's machinations, slowly began to heal as we both worked to understand the damage that had been done. My father, devastated by the revelation of who he had married and what he had allowed to happen to his own daughter, threw himself into making amends. He had been genuinely deceived by Patricia's manipulations, but he took full responsibility for failing to protect me. Together, we began the long process of rebuilding our relationship, aided by family therapy and his complete commitment to supporting my future. 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, I was sitting in my new apartment near Stanford University, where I had been accepted with a full scholarship funded by the recovery of my mother's trust fund. The $3 million plus interest and damages had grown to nearly $5 million, enough to secure my future in ways I had never imagined possible. The white BMW had indeed been sold for scrap, exactly as I had told Patricia it would be. But rather than being worthless, the insurance payout from the vehicle's destruction had provided additional evidence of Patricia's fraud, since she had been planning to collect on a life insurance policy she had secretly taken out on me. Every piece of her plan had been turned against her. Every manipulation had been exposed. Every cruelty had been repaid tenfold. But the most satisfying part wasn't the money or the justice or even the knowledge that Patricia would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The most satisfying part was the letter I received from her 3 months into her sentence. Arya, I know you won't believe this, but I never meant for things to go as far as they did. When I married your father, I thought I could learn to love you as my own daughter. But you reminded me so much of your mother, and I had worked so hard to make your father forget her. I couldn't stand seeing her in your face every day. The money started as just borrowing. I told myself I would pay it back. But the more I took, the more I felt like I deserved it. Your mother had everything I wanted: a loving husband, a beautiful daughter, financial security. When she died, I thought I could finally have those things. But you were always there, a reminder that I was the replacement, not the original. I never planned to hurt you. The car thing just seemed like the easiest way to solve all my problems at once. You have to understand, by then I was in too deep. There was no way to give the money back without admitting what I had done. I thought if you were gone, everyone would just move on, and I could keep the life I had built. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I want you to know that losing everything, my freedom, my reputation, my daughter's respect, it's exactly what I deserve. You won. You beat me completely, and I'm almost impressed by how thoroughly you destroyed my life. I hope you're happy now. I hope you become everything your mother wanted you to be. Patricia, I read the letter 3 times, then carefully fed it into the shredder in my home office. Some confessions don't deserve preservation. The next day, I mailed Patricia a single sheet of paper with just one line written in my mother's favorite purple ink. I already am. I never heard from her again. 2 years later, I was thriving in ways that seemed impossible from the perspective of my previous life. Stanford had been everything I had hoped for and more. I was majoring in criminal justice with a specialty in financial crimes, inspired by my experience with Patricia's fraud and motivated by a desire to help other victims of family financial abuse. Aunt Catherine and I had developed a close relationship that filled some of the void left by my mother's death. She had become both a mentor and a friend, guiding me through the complexities of the legal system and helping me understand the broader implications of Patricia's crimes. My father and I had rebuilt our relationship stronger than it had ever been before. The crisis had forced him to confront his own failures and blind spots, and he had committed himself completely to being the parent I deserved. We had dinner together every Sunday when I was home from school, and he never tired of hearing about my studies and plans. Even Melissa had become something like a sister to me. Free from Patricia's influence, she had revealed herself to be intelligent, compassionate, and deeply remorseful about her role in my mistreatment. She was in therapy, working through the damage of being raised by a narcissistic manipulator, and we supported each other as we both learned what healthy family relationships looked like. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in my own sense of identity. In my previous life, I had died believing I was worthless, unloved, and forgotten. I had internalized Patricia's psychological abuse so deeply that even in those final moments before the crash, I had blamed myself for somehow deserving what was happening to me. Now I knew better. I knew that my mother had loved me enough to leave me a substantial inheritance. I knew that my father's blindness had been manipulated rather than natural. I knew that Aunt Catherine had tried to maintain contact with me for years before Patricia severed those ties. I knew that Melissa's cruelty had been taught rather than instinctive. Most importantly, I knew that I had the strength to not just survive trauma, but to transform it into justice. The knowledge that came with my rebirth had been a gift, but it wasn't magic. I had still needed to be smart, strategic, and brave enough to act on that knowledge. I had still needed to rebuild relationships, gather evidence, and trust people who had reasons to help me. The unfair advantage had been information, but everything else, the planning, the execution, the emotional work of healing, had been my own achievement. On the 3rd anniversary of my graduation day, I drove up the mountain road where I had died in my previous life. This time, I was behind the wheel of a car I had bought with my own money, a reliable Honda that reflected my practical nature rather than any need to impress. I parked at the overlook where the accident had occurred and stood looking out over the valley below. Somewhere down there, Patricia was beginning her 4th year in federal prison. Her appeals had been exhausted, her assets liquidated, her reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. But I wasn't thinking about Patricia as I stood there. I was thinking about my mother and the inheritance she had left me that went far beyond money. She had given me her intelligence, her determination, and her capacity for love. Patricia had tried to steal those things along with the trust fund, but some gifts can't be taken by force. I was thinking about my father, who had made terrible mistakes but was working every day to earn my forgiveness and rebuild our relationship. Second chances, I had learned, weren't just for people who died and came back to life. I was thinking about Melissa, who was now studying psychology and planning to specialize in family trauma. She wanted to help children who were growing up in situations like the one we had both endured to spot the signs that adults had missed in our case. I was thinking about Aunt Catherine, who had used her position and resources to ensure that justice was served, and who had become the maternal figure I had needed for so many years. And I was thinking about myself, not the broken, abused girl Patricia had tried to create, but the strong, capable woman I had chosen to become. The woman who had turned the tables so completely that the predator had become the prey. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that my mother would have loved. I took out my phone and called my father. "Hey, Dad," I said when he answered. "I'm up at the Overlook. I just wanted to call and tell you I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm with emotion. "Are you okay?" "I'm perfect," I said. And for the first time in either of my lives, it was completely true. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the BMW that had been meant to be my tomb. Patricia had intended it as the instrument of my destruction, but instead it had become the key to her downfall. The gift that was supposed to end my life had instead given me the evidence I needed to reclaim it. There was poetry in that irony that I thought my mother would appreciate. I had sold Patricia's murder weapon for scrap, knowing exactly what it represented. But what I had bought with that action, justice, peace, a future free from fear, was worth more than any amount of twisted metal. In my rearview mirror, the mountain road disappeared into darkness. Behind me lay the site of my death and rebirth. Ahead lay a life I had fought to claim and earned the right to live. The gift Patricia had given me wasn't a car. It wasn't even the means of my destruction. It was the opportunity to prove that some people are too strong to stay buried, even when they've been 6 feet under. I drove home to start the rest of my life. 5 years later, the law firm of Catherine and Associates was housed in a gleaming downtown office building with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of the city. My name was on the door now, Catherine and Stevens, and I had just finished my first week as a junior partner, specializing in family financial crimes. Our latest case involved a stepfather who had been systematically draining his wife's disabled son's trust fund to support his gambling addiction. The parallels to my own situation were obvious, but I approached the work with professional detachment and personal passion that served my clients well. "Knock, knock," Catherine said, peering around my office door. "How are you settling in?" "Perfectly," I said, gesturing to the stack of case files on my desk. "Mrs. Rodriguez's situation is worse than we initially thought, but I think we can recover most of what her stepfather stole. The paper trail is surprisingly comprehensive for someone who thought he was being clever." "They always think they're cleverer than they are," Catherine said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Speaking of which, I have something for you." She handed me a manila envelope with my name written on it in familiar handwriting. My heart rate picked up as I recognized Patricia's script. "This came addressed to the firm," Catherine explained. "She must have found out about your career change. I've already had it screened for safety, but you don't have to read it if you don't want to." I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the weight of whatever Patricia had felt compelled to say after 5 years of silence. "I'm curious," I admitted. "Take your time," Catherine said. "I'll be in my office if you need to talk after." I waited until I was alone before opening the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Patricia's careful handwriting. "Aria, I saw the newspaper article about your law firm partnership. Local attorney specializes in family financial crimes. They even mentioned your personal experience with financial abuse and attempted murder, though they were careful not to name me specifically, and I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I know that's a strange thing for me to say, given what I did, but it's true. You've become exactly the kind of person who would have been able to stop someone like me. There's justice in that. I've been thinking a lot about what I wrote to you before, about how you reminded me of your mother. I said it like it was a bad thing. But sitting here now, I realize it was the highest compliment I could have given you. Your mother was everything I pretended to be. Intelligent, principled, strong enough to build something meaningful with her life. I destroyed my own daughter's respect for me and spent years trying to destroy you. But you wouldn't be destroyed. You turned every weapon I used against you into something that made you stronger. I failed to break you, and now you're helping other people avoid what I tried to do to you. I have 15 more years to serve on my sentence. I'll be 77 when I get out, if I live that long. My health isn't good, and prison is hard on someone who used to have as much as I had. But I want you to know that I've used this time to try to understand what made me into the kind of person who could plan to murder her stepdaughter for money. I was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder 3 years ago. It doesn't excuse what I did, but it explains some of it. I spent my whole life feeling entitled to things that belong to other people. I convinced myself that if I wanted something badly enough, that wanting justified taking it. The therapy here is limited, but I'm trying to become a different person. Not because I expect forgiveness or because I think it will change anything for you, but because I owe it to Melissa to try. She writes to me sometimes, and I want to be someone worthy of her letters. I'll never be released early. I'll never be anything other than a cautionary tale about what happens when privilege and entitlement go unchecked. But maybe that has value too. Maybe other people will read about what I did and recognize those same impulses in themselves before they act on them. I hope your life is everything you've worked to make it. I hope you're surrounded by people who value you the way I should have. I hope you never have to deal with anyone like me again, except professionally, where you can destroy them the way you destroyed me. Patricia, P.S. I still have that photo you sent me 5 years ago, the one with just the single line, "I already am." I keep it on my cell wall as a reminder that some people really are too strong to be broken. I read the letter twice, then set it down on my desk. The woman who had written this seemed genuinely different from the Patricia who had tried to murder me for an inheritance. Prison and therapy had apparently forced her to confront truths about herself that she had spent a lifetime avoiding. But I felt no sympathy for her situation. The letter was well written and seemingly sincere, but it was also entirely too little, too late. Patricia had had countless opportunities to choose differently, to treat me with basic human decency, to acknowledge my worth as a person. She had chosen cruelty and greed instead, and now she was living with the consequences of those choices. The fact that she was finally capable of recognizing my strength didn't erase the years she had spent trying to break me. The fact that she was proud of my accomplishments didn't undo the damage she had inflicted or the trauma she had caused. I stood and walked to the shredder in the corner of my office. For a moment, I hesitated. This letter was evidence of Patricia's psychological evolution, proof that even someone capable of such evil could potentially change. From a clinical perspective, it was fascinating, but from a personal perspective, it was just another attempt by Patricia to insert herself into my life. Even from prison, even after everything that had happened, she still felt entitled to my attention, to a response, to some kind of connection with me. I fed the letter into the shredder and watched it disappear into tiny strips. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Dinner Sunday? I'm making your mom's lasagna recipe." I smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." That evening, I drove home to the house I had bought in the same neighborhood where I'd grown up, but on the opposite side from where Patricia's mansion had stood before. It was sold to pay my damages judgment. The house was smaller, more practical, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelves, every photograph on the walls represented choices I had made with money I had earned. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw a familiar car parked across the street. Melissa got out and waved, carrying a bottle of wine and a bag of takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant. "Surprise!" she called. "I thought we could celebrate your first week at the firm." "Perfect timing," I said, genuinely pleased to see her. I could use some company. We sat on my back patio as the sun set, eating pad thai and drinking wine, while Melissa told me about her graduate program and her internship at a children's advocacy center. She was thriving in ways that would have been impossible under Patricia's influence, building a career focused on protecting vulnerable children from the kind of abuse we had both experienced. "I got another letter from her today," Melissa said eventually. I didn't need to ask who she meant. "Did you read it?" "Yeah, she told me about the letter she sent to your office. I wanted to check on you." "I'm fine," I said honestly. "She doesn't have the power to upset me anymore." "Good," Melissa said firmly. "She lost the right to be part of our lives when she tried to kill you." I write back sometimes because my therapist thinks it helps with my own healing, but I've never forgiven her. I never will. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the stars come out over the city lights. I thought about the two versions of this evening that existed in my experience. In my previous life, I had been dead for 5 years by this point, my potential unrealized, and my story ended by Patricia's greed and hatred. In this reality, I was surrounded by people who loved me, building a career that gave my traumatic experience meaning and purpose, and living in a house that represented everything I had fought to reclaim. You know what I realized today? I said to Melissa. Patricia was right about one thing. I am like my mother. But that was never a weakness. It was always my greatest strength. Melissa raised her wine glass in a toast. To your mother, then, and to strength. To strength, I agreed, clinking my glass against hers, and to justice. As we finished our wine and planned our next sister dinner, I felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived and a victory completely earned. Patricia had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, she had only succeeded in showing me how much I was capable of fighting for. The gift she had intended as my destruction had become the foundation of my strength. And that strength would last me the rest of my very long, very successful, very well-deserved life. The girl who had died in a BMW with cut brakes was gone forever. The woman who had risen from that death was unstoppable. And Patricia, in her prison cell with her therapy sessions and her letters of repentance, was exactly where she belonged. A cautionary tale about what happens when you underestimate someone who refuses to stay broken. The rest of my story was mine to write. 10 years later, the courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators for what the media had dubbed the trust fund killer trial. I sat at the prosecutor's table as the lead attorney for the state, presenting evidence against a man who had murdered his elderly stepfather for a $20 million inheritance. The parallels to my own case were impossible to ignore, but this time I was the one seeking justice rather than receiving it. The defendant, Marcus Holloway, had convinced his stepfather to change his will, then administered a slow-acting poison that mimicked the symptoms of the old man's existing heart condition. It was a more sophisticated approach than Patricia's brake-line sabotage, but the motive was identical, greed disguised as family loyalty. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I said during my closing argument, the defense wants you to believe that Mr. Holloway's stepfather died of natural causes. They want you to ignore the forensic evidence of digitalis poisoning. They want you to overlook the suspicious timing of the will change. Most importantly, they want you to forget that Marcus Holloway had motive, means, and opportunity to commit this murder. I walked to the evidence table and picked up a photograph of the victim, a kind-faced man named Robert Chen, who had welcomed his wife's adult son into his home and treated him like family. Robert Chen trusted his stepson, I continued. He provided for him, supported his business ventures, and ultimately left him everything in his will. Marcus Holloway repaid that trust with murder. The defense will tell you that family members don't kill each other for money. I'm here to tell you that they absolutely do. The jury was riveted. Some of them had undoubtedly followed my own story in the news over the years, and they understood that I was speaking from experience. The evidence is overwhelming, I concluded. The forensic analysis, the timeline, the financial records, everything points to one inescapable conclusion. Marcus Holloway poisoned his stepfather for money, and he must be held accountable for that crime. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Marcus Holloway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As I packed up my files after the sentencing, I felt the familiar satisfaction that came with securing justice for a victim who couldn't speak for themselves. This was why I had become a prosecutor. This was how I honored both my mother's memory and my own survival. "Excellent work," my boss, District Attorney Sarah Williams, said as she approached my table. That was some of the finest courtroom advocacy I've seen in 20 years. "Thank you," I said. "Cases like this, they matter to me." "I know they do, which is why I want to talk to you about something. Walk with me?" We left the courthouse together and strolled through the downtown area toward my office. The city had grown and changed over the past decade, but I still felt a sense of ownership over these streets. This was where I had rebuilt my life, where I had claimed my place in the world. "There's going to be an opening for a federal prosecutor position," Sarah said. "Specifically, a role focusing on financial crimes and family violence. The position would be based here, but you'd be handling cases across the state." It's a significant step up, and frankly, I can't think of anyone better qualified. The offer was tempting. Federal cases meant larger resources, more complex investigations, and the opportunity to impact policy at a national level. But it also meant leaving behind the local community where I had established myself, where I had built relationships and earned trust. I'll need to think about it, I said. Of course, take your time. The position won't be officially posted for another month, but I wanted to give you advance notice. That evening, I called my father to discuss the opportunity. At 72, he was officially retired, but still consulted for his old engineering firm. He had never remarried after Patricia's imprisonment, choosing instead to focus on rebuilding his relationship with me and supporting his community through volunteer work. It sounds like an incredible opportunity, he said after I explained the federal position. Are you worried about leaving your current job? A little, I admitted. I've built something here. My colleagues respect me. I know the local judges and defense attorneys. I understand how the system works. Starting over at the federal level means learning new protocols, new people, new politics. But it also means the chance to help more people, my father pointed out. You've always said that your goal is to protect families from the kind of predators who destroyed ours. This position would give you a bigger platform for that work. He was right, of course. The local cases I handled were important, but federal prosecution would allow me to tackle larger conspiracies, interstate crimes, and systematic abuse that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. It was the logical next step in my career. What does your gut tell you? He asked. My gut tells me I'm ready, I said. I've spent 10 years proving myself at the local level. Maybe it's time to take on bigger challenges. Then you have your answer. After we hung up, I sat in my home office looking at the wall where I displayed my law degree, my bar admission certificate, and a framed newspaper article about Patricia's conviction. The headline read, Socialite Sentenced to Life for Stepchild Murder Plot. Below it was a smaller article about my graduation from law school and my decision to specialize in family financial crimes. The girl in that second article looked young and determined, ready to take on the world. 10 years later, I felt like I had lived up to her ambition. My phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. The caller ID showed Catherine's number. I heard about the Holloway conviction, she said without preamble. Congratulations. That was a difficult case. Thank you. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something else. There's a federal prosecutor position opening up. Sarah Williams recommended me for it. Family financial crimes and violence prevention? How did you— Never mind, of course you already know about it. The federal prosecutor community isn't that large. Catherine laughed. I may have heard some rumors, and I may have mentioned your name to some people when they were discussing qualified candidates. You recommended me. I told them the truth, that you're the most effective prosecutor I've ever seen when it comes to family violence cases, and that your personal experience gives you insights that can't be taught in law school. I felt a surge of gratitude for my aunt, who had been supporting my career behind the scenes for years. Do you think I should take it? I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But if you want my opinion, you've outgrown the local level. You're ready for cases that match your abilities. That night, I made my decision. I called Sarah Williams and accepted her recommendation for the federal position. The interview process would be extensive, but I felt confident about my qualifications and my readiness for the challenge. 6 months later, my first federal case as a prosecutor involved a multi-state conspiracy where a group of individuals had been targeting elderly widows, convincing them to change their wills, and then hastening their deaths through various means. The case had tentacles reaching from California to Florida, involving millions of dollars in stolen inheritances and at least 12 suspicious deaths. The lead defendant was a woman named Victoria Sterling, a former estate planning attorney who had been systematically identifying and exploiting vulnerable seniors. Her methods were sophisticated. She would establish relationships with elderly clients, gradually isolate them from their families, convince them to name her as their beneficiary, and then arrange for their deaths through hired accomplices. The investigation had taken 2 years and involved coordination between multiple federal agencies. By the time the case reached my desk, we had phone intercepts, financial records, witness testimony, and forensic evidence linking Sterling to the conspiracy. But what struck me most about the case was how similar Sterling's psychology was to Patricia's. Both women had felt entitled to wealth that belonged to others. Both had used manipulation and isolation to control their victims. Both had ultimately resorted to murder when their other methods weren't sufficient. The difference was scale. Patricia had focused her criminal energy on destroying one family. Sterling had built an entire enterprise around exploiting multiple families. "This is personal for you, isn't it?" my co-counsel, Agent Rebecca Martinez, asked during one of our preparation sessions. Rebecca was the FBI agent who had originally arrested Patricia, and we had maintained a professional relationship over the years. "All victim advocacy is personal," I said carefully. "That's what makes me effective." "I've seen the parallels too," she said. "Sterling's methodology is similar to what your stepmother did, just on a larger scale." "Patricia was an amateur compared to Sterling," I said. "But yes, there are similarities. Both women saw elderly or vulnerable people as resources to be exploited rather than human beings to be respected." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Sterling's defense team tried to argue that she was simply an estate planning attorney who had developed close relationships with her clients, and that their deaths were coincidental, but the evidence was overwhelming. We had recordings of Sterling discussing the timing of her clients' deaths with her accomplices. We had financial records showing how she had systematically drained their accounts. Most damning of all, we had testimony from a conspirator who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. During my closing argument, I looked directly at Sterling as I spoke to the jury. Victoria Sterling saw elderly people not as human beings with dignity and worth, but as opportunities for profit, I said. She identified victims who were lonely, isolated, and vulnerable. She befriended them, gained their trust, and then systematically destroyed their lives for money. Sterling stared back at me with the same cold hatred I had seen in Patricia's eyes years earlier. Some people, I had learned, were incapable of genuine remorse. They could only feel anger at being caught and punished for their crimes. The defense wants you to believe that 12 elderly people just happened to die shortly after changing their wills to benefit Miss Sterling, I continued. They want you to ignore the forensic evidence of poisoning. They want you to overlook the recorded conversations where she discusses accelerating her clients' deaths. They want you to forget that she profited millions of dollars from these deaths. I walked closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "But you are too intelligent to be fooled by such obvious deceptions. The evidence is clear. Victoria Sterling is a serial killer who used her position as an attorney to identify and murder vulnerable elderly people. She must be held accountable for these crimes." The jury convicted Sterling on all counts. She was sentenced to death, though I knew the appeals process would likely keep her alive for decades. But the important thing was that she would never be able to hurt anyone else. After the sentencing, I stood outside the federal courthouse talking to reporters about the case. One of them asked me about the personal connection between Sterling's crimes and my own experience with Patricia. "Both cases involve predators who targeted family members for financial gain," I said. "But I want to be clear about something. This prosecution wasn't about revenge or personal vindication. It was about justice for 12 elderly victims who deserved better than what Victoria Sterling gave them." "Do you see parallels between your stepmother's case and this one?" another reporter asked. "I see parallels in the psychology," I said. "People who feel entitled to things that don't belong to them. People who view relationships as transactions rather than genuine human connections. People who are willing to commit murder for money. Unfortunately, these cases are more common than most people realize." What would you say to other families dealing with similar situations? "I would say that financial abuse within families is a real and serious crime," I said. "If you suspect that someone is manipulating or exploiting an elderly or vulnerable family member, don't ignore those concerns. Contact law enforcement, contact social services, contact an attorney who specializes in elder abuse. These crimes thrive in secrecy and isolation. Bringing them into the light is the first step toward stopping them." That evening, I returned to my apartment in Washington, D.C., where I had relocated for the federal position. The apartment was smaller than my house back home, but it was in a building with excellent security and a view of the monuments that never failed to inspire me. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my balcony, looking out over the city where laws were made and justice was administered. Somewhere in a federal prison, Victoria Sterling was beginning what would likely be the rest of her life behind bars. Somewhere else, Patricia was in her 10th year of her own sentence, still trying to justify her crimes through letters that I no longer read. But I wasn't thinking about either of them as I sat there. I was thinking about the 12 elderly victims whose families could finally have closure. I was thinking about the potential victims who would never be targeted because Sterling was no longer free to hunt them. Most of all, I was thinking about the girl who had died on a mountain road 15 years earlier and how she would feel about the woman I had become. I thought she would be proud. My phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. Saw the news about the Sterling conviction. Incredible work. Dinner next week when you're back in town? I typed back, absolutely, I have so much to tell you. Another text, this one from my father. Watched your press conference. Your mother would be so proud of who you've become. And finally, one from Catherine. Another monster behind bars. Well done. I smiled and put my phone away. Tomorrow, I would start reviewing files for my next case. A complex fraud scheme involving a network of fake charities that had been stealing donations meant for disaster victims. The work would be demanding, but it would also be meaningful. The gift that Patricia had tried to give me, a car with cut brakes and a planned death, had instead given me a purpose that shaped every day of my life. Every case I prosecuted, every predator I put behind bars, every family I helped protect was part of the legacy that had grown from her attempt to destroy me. She had tried to take everything from me. Instead, she had shown me exactly who I was meant to become. As the sun set over the nation's capital, I raised my wine glass in a silent toast to my mother, to justice, and to the unbreakable strength that had carried me through death and back to life. The girl who had been murdered for an inheritance had become the woman who protected others from the same fate. There was poetry in that transformation, and justice in that purpose. Patricia's gift had been meant to end my story. Instead, it had become the beginning of everything I was meant to be. I finished my wine and went inside to prepare for another day of making sure that predators like Patricia and Sterling faced the consequences of their choices. It was work that would last me a lifetime, and I couldn't imagine anything I'd rather do with the years I had fought so hard to reclaim. The rest of my story, all of it, was dedicated to making sure that other families wouldn't have to endure what mine had suffered. And that was a gift worth more than any inheritance could ever be.